Usually Paul records it. Oh, somebody's done it. Okay. So welcome to the community call. The first thing on our agenda is D with an update on off policy V2.
Okay, so share my screen. Yep. So this is the epic issue where we're tracking all the work for off policy V2. So I made sure to update it yesterday. So first thing we did was in Altarino we released the new version of the API. Yesterday we also released the new version of Altarino 0.15.0, which allowed us to also bump the version of the Golang types we import in the Kuadrant operator to this version. This was needed to upgrade all the inner types of the auth policy to be based on auth-config v1 beta 2, which we divided in 2 steps. So number 1 was just a straightforward porting of the auth scheme types, followed by the introduction of the root selectors. We also bumped the version of the Altarino operator that the Kuadrant operator depends upon to 0.90, just released. So we also got the latest version of the Altarino CR or the Altarino Golang type that the Kuadrant operator uses to request the Altarino instance. And this was needed because we are now using this new feature added to Altarino and Altarino operator that allows to supersede a subset of the host, a strict subset of the host names between 2 auth configs. So this is all done, right? Even though the only one that shows here in purple, because this is the only one that effectively has been merged, all the others here are waiting for review, and all targeting a base branch of auth policy v2, which I made sure to rebase on top of main just a couple of hours ago. Other than that, we are still pending on just some minor update on the set implementation detail on how we implement root selectors. It's currently depending on the old selectors in Altarino for things like request path, request method, right? These attributes of the HP request. But now that we have the well-known attributes implemented in Altarino and part of 0.15, we can also update that in the internal implementation. So it's just replace one for the other and to make it more readable, even though we won't change anything in terms of functionality. We also need to do some work on the status of the auth policy resource. I'm separating this because pretty much the same work we need to do for all policy, we are still planning on doing for the rate limit policy. So probably we're going to tackle this bundle. So rate limit policy and auth policy basically need to implement the recommendations of this RFC here by DDA. Separate from this, there's one specific thing that also touches rate limit policy, but only because it's not specified in the RFC in regards with root selectors in those kinds of policies that fail to select a specific HP route rule. Currently, we are just skipping those, but we're not reporting anywhere other than the logs. So the idea is that we also update the status service resource with that specific information. And then all the rest is documentation, right? So a user guide of enforcing authentication authorization with the Kuadrant auth policy, both for app developers and platform engineers. I was planning on writing something reusing this demo here that I shared the other day. Right, it's basically it's based on auth policy v2, the branch, right, for where we implemented the bigger chunk of the work. Right, so we have 2 use cases here, one for an auth policy created by an app developer, right? And another one created by a platform engineer targeting the gateway. So the idea was write some user guide based on that. And it would be the first user guide we have exclusively focused on all without the rate limiting part in the documentation for the Kuadrant operator. We also missed some official documentation or official spec on the alt policy resource in the Kuadrant operator repo. We have something for rate limit, but we have nothing for the alt policy. It's very, very outdated. The only documentation that we have for alt policy there, which was still formatted as a proposal. So the idea is we also have some official specification there. But I think more important than the previous one are these last two bullet points here. So one is to make sure we document some use cases that we are not covering currently with alt policy v2. Currently, there's just one known use case that we are not covering, which is the use case where a host has been taken already, meaning you have one policy that targets a network resource that specifies a host name, and then you try to create a second alt policy to another network resource that happens to declare the same host name, and that would generate a conflict because in Authorino, the host name is still being used as the lookup key, and via Istio, we have no other way to replace that, right? So currently, we cannot support that use case or use cases such as these ones that I'm exemplifying here, right? So like two HP routes that declare the same host name, or one alt policy targeting each HP route, or one HP route that repeats a host name declared in the gateway, and then you have two alt policies, one targeting the HP route, another one targeting the gateway. Effectively, having two alt policies that are meant for the same host name. And the last one is an edge case that we also need to document. So the way I'm explaining this is we have a rule and an exception for the rule. And it's about the semantics of the top level route selectors and the rules it selects with regards into the calling the external authorization service. So there is one exception there, or a few exceptions when the user specifies HP route rules or selects HP route rules that happen to use these patterns here, like the patch match regular expression, header match regular expression, or any of the HP query param match from Gateway API. Whenever this is the case, because Istio does not support those patterns in the Istio authorization policy, we are implementing those only in Authorino side, meaning that request that otherwise would not be sent to authorization service is being sent to the authorization service, but the authorization service will make sure to either enforce or not enforce depending on the rules. And that's it. So only a few more lines of code here. There's something I'm probably be tackling together with alt policy, these two bullet points here, and then documentation. That's it.
Thanks, Kay. Do you need any help with any of those reviews, or is there, you said there's quite a few open there, so?
Yeah, the more the better. I mean, the more eyes we can get on those PRs, the better. And sometimes it's about reviewing the code for sure, but it's also about trying to follow the verification steps. I try to leave, some instructions to run that version of the code, create policies, and try kind of a end-to-end testing of those.
Okay.
I see.
So
Thomas has his. Yeah, sorry. You go, Craig.
Sorry, I was just going to say there's a call out for help there. So if we can get some people looking at that, let's get those merged and get the Kuadrant operator released, right? And that will be the end of the MVP stream then. Okay, sorry, Thomas, go ahead.
No, just wondering, some of those to-do items are not necessarily part of for the MVP, right? Like the state thing, that we're not going to have that So maybe might be more clear to separate it out, so we know exactly what we still actually need to do before we can release, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Yeah.
Okay. Policy prerequisites. Yeah, so I put this in based on some conversations at the face-to-face, or meta policy is the other word. So it was an idea that was thrown around at the face-to-face when we were talking about like an API management POC, and the idea that came about was, if I wanted to be able to express that certain things had to be the case before an endpoint could be exposed publicly, or I guess exposed in any way. How would you go about doing that? And is it a use case for policy or not? So the example that I used for this was, for example, the listener must be HTTPS, and there must be a rate limit policy in place before the endpoint is updated with the A record to bring traffic to that. Now, since talking about that, I'm a bit conflicted. One part of me thinks this seems like a useful thing, like a good use case, but another part of me is saying, well, if it's about DNS, then in this case, should it be something that's in the DNS policy, right? Not a meta policy as such. And then the other thing that sort of I'm sort of exploring it internally is, if you want to have some kind of prerequisites to a policy, are you sort of leaking concerns? Like, if the DNS policy says, I need a rate limit policy and I need an auth policy in place, now the DNS policy needs to know about an auth policy and a DNS and a TLS policy, for instance. And how much does it need to know? Does it just need to know that there's one there? Or does it need to know that there's one there and it's targeting that gateway? Or does it need to know there's one there and there's actual content and it's valid, right? So the more and more I kind of thought about this, the more complex it became. I don't particularly like the idea of policies knowing about other policies. I feel like that's like leaking concerns, as I mentioned. And I don't know that I particularly like this idea of a meta policy either, where you have a policy that expects a lot of other policies in place. So yeah, I'm opening it up for debate here. Maybe nobody's got any thoughts right now, but maybe have a think about it. And I do feel like if there is something that should prevent an A record being created. So we already do. I'm jumping around a little bit here. But we already do a little bit of this internally with DNS policy. So with DNS policy, without the user really knowing this at this point, if there's a HTTPS listener and there is no TLS secret in place yet, then we won't create the A record, right? Because we want to wait for the HTTPS secret to be in place and for that to be synced down to the spoke before we're ready to say, yeah, okay, we can add the A record for that now and bring traffic safely to that endpoint. So that's like a prerequisite that we created ourselves internally. Whether it's the right prerequisite or not, that's up for debate, but not really what we're debating here. So yeah, go for it, Thomas.
Yeah, no, it reminds me of the another way of looking at it could be that a gateway policy could be kind of a meta policy for a route policy, like in a way that where you have the defaults and overrides, or it could be like one way of looking at this would be a set of default policies, opinionated default policies that you could install when you install Quadrant. Like, for example, I was the other day talking with Guy about, like, it would be nice if you install Quadrant, that then, you know, all the endpoints are closed by default because of a policy, like a very simple policy that has a star and just closes everything. And you need to actually add things to it instead of having to close down things. So it's like, it's zero trust by default. I'm not sure how close this comes to what you discussed, and but it feels like a sort of like a meta policy is like a set of rules for that you want your org to behave within certain boundaries. So I think that's partly covered by the potential of overrides and defaults for gateway policies versus routes. And I rather like the idea of having a set of opinionated default policies that you can activate upon installing Quadrant. That, you know, I'm not sure if it covers the whole thing, but just another way of looking at it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Guy?
I do like the idea of the prerequisites being expressed in the form of a policy itself, although I don't know how to solve the problem of the references between policies nonetheless. Also interesting the point that Thomas raised about the gateway policies serving as kind of defaults that might already cover a good deal of the use cases that I imagine we'll be tackling with this prerequisites thing, right? And also, Thomas mentioned Zero Trust Network, right? That also reminds me of a talk that we did not have in our last, in our face-to-face last week, about good practices for using Quadrant safely, right? There are all sorts of things that one may want to ensure in the cluster before opening up an endpoint or before using Quadrant or while using Quadrant. Certainly the things that you mentioned, like if a rate limit policy is in place, null policy is in place, or our kind of policies, but also all other kinds of policies, like Kubernetes network policies, for example, right? Or configurations in the service mesh, right? In the underlying service mesh, there are things that one may want to ensure before starting use, before sending traffic to a particular spoke cluster, right? Our back rules and all sorts of things. So we don't really know if we can create some kind of meta policy that encompasses all of those cases or not. But it kind of feels like that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? Because like, I'll come to you in a second, Dave. So I kind of like what you're saying, Thomas, and I kind of agree with you that, like, well, okay, let me rephrase this. I don't necessarily agree with having a default set of policies, but I do agree with this. This may be covered by having a set of policies in place at the gateway that you can override lower down, right? In our case, it's not with overrides and defaults, but it's by replacing the policy. But you could do that. And that probably would cover quite a few of the use cases. And that might come under, as you say, using Quadrant safely. So it's probably worth thinking about that at first, right? Like, what could I do with the existing policies that would make sure that an endpoint would be exposed safely? And then, like, do I have all the comfort that I need, right? Do I have everything that I need in order to feel comfortable by creating these policies at the gateway level, so that I know that if there's no policy lower down, these ones will take effect? Yeah, I think that's a good point. And maybe that is effectively the meta policy, which is I've created these other policies. Dave.
Yeah, just wondering about the what's the actual use case we're trying to solve here, because I can think of like two ways of approaching it depending on what is the ultimate goal here. So, for example, one thing is like the DNS policy, where it doesn't create the record until the TLS policy piece has done its bit. and that dependency stuff which you talked about, and there's some trouble there, right? But there's also a different side, which I think kind of alluded to as well, which is more conformance within a cluster where these policies have to exist, or these fields in these policies have to be set within these bounds, kind of like the OCM policy framework, where you enforce that, or maybe you just report back and say this is conformant or not. So what is the goal? To kind of put things in place, the framework in place, or is it to prevent certain things happening until the policies are all enforced?
I think that's a good way of putting it, actually. Conformance is a good word to use. So yes, that's the use case, right? Is I want to put up these guardrails so that an endpoint can't be exposed from my gateway without me knowing that these guardrails have been met.
So is it sufficient in this model to say the guardrails are met if those policies exist? Now, in the ordering of things, and when the DNS record gets created, that's a separate problem, but just the guardrails are the policies being there.
I think that's where I would start. Yeah. I don't know if you need to go further than that. Maybe you would at some point want to go further than that, but
it gets more complex. So I think a good place to start and see, are there use cases beyond that?
Then the question is, like, is that viable outside of OCM's policy framework? As in, like, we've been talking a fair bit about single cluster and multi-cluster. So if you're in a single cluster context and you're the admin for that cluster and you've set up the gateway and you want to decide when an HTTP route can be, or when an endpoint should be exposed or traffic should be brought to that HTTP route. I just triggered a thought in me, which I'm going to come back to. It seems like it could be useful in a single cluster as well, right? So maybe we don't want to rely on the OCM policy framework, or we want to take that controller and be able to use it in a single cluster, right?
Which I think you can do. I think the policy stuff, it's just pushing down a policy controller, if you want to call it that, or policy agent to a single cluster. Okay. So I think it's possible.
Controller. All right. If it doesn't have like that, the key would be that you don't have to install the rest of OCM in order to use it. What's the name of that controller? Policy framework, or?
I'll dig it out. I'll find it here. Yeah.
I think it's also good then to separate those what we're talking about now from the example that you gave, that we already secretly do that. Like we don't let the traffic pass before the SSL. But that makes sense. That's just because it wouldn't make any sense. That's not some kind of business level policy that I want to enforce. That's just us being smart, and that's the same thing with the DNS. With the DNS routing, we check if the new one already is available, and otherwise we don't send the traffic there. That's kind of what you'd expect from a product, right? That's not something that anybody would want.
Yeah, but what it made me think here, though, when we were talking is what you actually want, is what we actually want, or what you would actually want as a user, is the policy for when a HTTP route is accepted by a gateway. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm going to create this HTTP route, I'm going to target this gateway, but I want the gateway controller to obey these rules before it actually even configures the gateway at all, right, to route traffic to that endpoint. Is there maybe that more, or is that a different use case? That would require the gateway provider doing something, right? But it might be an interesting use case to bring upstream to see if there's others that see that as a thing. Okay. A bit more to think about in there. So part one being, how far can we get with just creating policies at the gateway to apply a set of guardrails that will at least control things like auth and rate limiting for you? And point two, we're already looking at the policy framework for other reasons, but maybe we can look to see, is that possible to use that in a single cluster without all the rest of OCM in order to validate that certain policies are in place? Okay. Anything else on this one?
How, if you don't meet the guardrails, how do we say that back to the user? Is it just in the status and in some of the
Yeah.
policies, or okay?
I think there's different ways of doing that. I think you could do it. Well, there's a few places you can do it. One would be like in the gateway listener status. Another would be in the HTTP route status, just adding a condition into those objects to say this has not been exposed, DNS not configured, or whatever the case may be. Yes, but I think you would use status to do that.
And is it a case of does it try to go as far as it can until it meets the policy? Say if certain guardrails are met, but there's one that's not, does it just act like none of them are in place, or does it act like some of them are and some of them aren't?
I think it's an all or nothing thing.
Okay.
In my opinion, they all have to be in place. Otherwise, just don't specify it. Right.
Looking at this long term as well, I think it'd be useful to have an observability piece around this. So you have a centralized dashboard with all your conformance checks or your guardrails and making sure that all the gateways are adhering to it. And if they're not, we've got some way of surfacing that up. So that'd be quite useful.
I'd be surprised if the OCM policy framework didn't have something to be able to observe that. But I'm going to make a note of it because it's a good point.
Yeah, I'm going to say something super weird that's kind of not related, but I was thinking the other day, like, imagine the managed service of this, and then the hub is the managed service, and then even the single cluster use case is actually 2 clusters, because it's my single cluster managed by myself, and the hub is there, and OCM, you always want the whole package.
Yeah.
So maybe the single cluster use case should already install everything, at least for that variability, for the managed service story. I'm not sure if it's sellable for you manage it yourself, and then you need basically 2 clusters to run your single, because you're going to have 1 cluster for your control plane. I'm not sure. I'm just wanted to share. I'm not sure it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if the hub could be part of a managed service, like you would have to gate access to resources pretty carefully, and namespaces and things like that. But yeah, why not? Like, you create a namespace, you register some clusters with it. You'd need to identify those clusters with a group of users, and then bind that set of clusters to their namespace. Theoretically, it seems possible, and then you could create your gateway. But yeah, so when you register the cluster, you'd have to install all the bits at that point, right? But that seems like a very different. I would say that's a very different set of problems at that point, because you're kind of making your hub cluster multi-tenant at that point.
Yeah, I'm just. It's more like about, like, should we really keep that single cluster versus multi-cluster use case so separate, or should we not?
Oh, I see. I would argue that we should still do that, because I don't expect that the majority of use cases upstream are going to be, I'm going to run a managed service with a managed hub and you can join your spoke, or I'm going to start with 15 clusters, I need a hub and 14 spokes, right? Like, I would expect that. I mean, this is just like our hunch, right? We don't actually have any data to back this up right now. If you can't start with just a gateway, just go to a cluster, create a gateway, use DNS policy, TLS policy, rate limit policy, auth policy, I think there's a good chance that people just drop off and go, oh, actually, that's way more than I need. I just wanted to get traffic into this cluster.
Yeah, but the fact that they're already running Kubernetes makes it already clear that they don't care about that. That they get way more than they need.
At least it's in one cluster, though.
Yeah, Alex pointed me to this virtual cluster solution. So you can actually, with one cluster, you can create multiple virtual clusters. So maybe Kuadrant creates one virtual cluster for your control plane in your cluster and solved. But yeah, I tend to agree. I just wanted to put it there.
Yeah, like I would debate that as well and say like that you're potentially just adding even more complexity at that point. Right. So, not only have you got OCM installed that you need to understand and work with, but now you've got this like virtual layer that's sitting on top of everything else as well. Anyway, I think another important point actually, Thomas, is like we want to be able to offer. One of the contribution offers that we want to try and make is for DNS policy and TLS policy into their representative upstream targets. So cert manager, external DNS. And I think if you start there and say, hey, you need to install OCM to use external DNS, like that's just going to be never gonna fly, right? Okay. Moving on, it's me again. So this issue that's been open for like a year and a half now, from way back when Raul was still here, about adding a name to the HTTP route rules. So basically, we wanted to be able to add a name. So in a gateway, you've got a listener, and each listener has a name. Makes sense. Now you can reference the listener by name. In the HTTP route, you can't name a routing rule. So each routing rule doesn't have a name. It just is just an array of routing rules. So Raul and I were like, hey, this is a bit silly. There should be a name here. Because then you can target a specific routing rule without, like, I don't know, using the index of the array or something. And that's where we came along with this idea. We went to Istio actually first, and Istio went to Gateway API and created this issue. And it's been going on since then. And it looked like it had made it in. It was actually going to be included in GA, and now it got dropped out of GA, and now it's gone back to we need more info. I think this is an opportunity for us. I think we see the use. We're the ones that actually indirectly opened this issue. Even we were still the ones that sort of ended up with this issue being opened. So I guess this is an opportunity for us to provide a real. There's a gap here, but it's like it's rubbish, right? Like there's an opportunity here to provide a real gap and try and drive this forward. So if you have an interest in doing something upstream with Gateway API, here's an opportunity. If you want to discuss it with me first, I'm open to that. Feel free to come talk to me. I can give you the context and history and all that kind of thing. But I really feel there's an opportunity here for us to make a change in Gateway API. Anyway, I want to bring that up because it keeps coming into my email every time it changes. Like, I can't believe we've gone back to more information again. Okay. Eguski.
Yeah, I remember this issue, and we had a clear use case, or this name in the HTTP route will make our lives much easier when we were working with the rate limiting filter. So we could, from the name, we could get a name in the envoy, which envoy has a name in the route, but it's not being filled by anything. So the name will be a nice place to having that name in the envoy route, we could add our configuration to that route. But now we have a WASM plugin, so it's all on our own. And my question is if we still need this for something specific, or I understand. I still think that it's a value. There is a value there only for the debugging issues. Yeah, there is a value. But
Well-
my question is if there is something really we need that for.
I would say the target ref change as well, right? Like they want to change the target ref so that you can target a named sub resource. Yeah. So like the gateway has a name on the listener, so you can target a listener. If we can get a name into the HTTP route rule, then you can target a specific rule with a policy rather than having to target the entire HTTP route. That's the other advantage I see. Guy, sorry, did I cover what you were going to say, or?
Yeah, you did already. Yeah, I think it's
Okay.
just to reinforce. I mean, it's good for user experience, so you can target a specific part of it. Also, the kind of feedback we can provide to the user later, right? Even if it's not part of the target ref, but say, for example, in the more fine-grained conditions that we add, where currently we have the root selectors, the whole purpose of having the root selectors as a separate thing of normal conditions was that we could relate directly with the things that we would find inside of the spec of the target network resources, right? So later we could go back in the status or any kind of analytics tool that we have and make sense out of the actual effective policy that we are enforcing, right? We could say, you know, this particular HP root of yours, this one is being protected this way and not that way, and not having to deal with all the sets and subsets that a completely free language to express conditions would imply.
Would it allow us to drop the routing rule match that's in the rate limit policy as well?
Yeah, it would definitely simplify it a lot, right? So instead of root selectors that you list HP route matches, just a list of names would do.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That means we need it as a required attribute.
No, not at all. I mean, just the name and less error prone. So that would be a lot better.
Yeah, but if you don't supply the name, or if you later remove the name, then you have a problem, right? With something that refers to it.
Yeah, that's an error case, so that's the situation, because it's like if you delete the gateway when the policy is targeting the gateway, you delete the target.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and well, in my opinion, at least, even if the name is not a required field, we could still make it mandatory for using Kuadrant, right? So if you want to use Kuadrant, create a rate limit policy, make sure that all your HP route rules are properly named, so you can target them in this specific limit definitions or specific auto rules within your policies.
Yeah, although I would try to avoid that if we could, I think, just because it feels like making them use the gateway API in a specific way. If we could say, if you add a name, you get these advantages, right? That might be a good way to kind of put the carrot out there. Excuse me. Something else came to mind there, and it's gone now. Ugh, sorry, it's gone. Yeah, go for it, Guy. Oh, sorry, I'm done with that one. If you're interested in taking this on, let me know, and I can work with you on it. But yeah, we can leave it there. Thomas, canceling community calls.
Yeah, very small. Like last week we canceled, and I gave it some more thought. I even added it later to the Slack thread, but probably didn't read it. But like, I think we shouldn't cancel. Like, if there's anybody there from us to be there and just start the call, we should do the call and then, wait 5 minutes max to see if somebody shows up. I know that we're all like still internal people here, basically, but we want this to be the community call, and I think it should be something you can count on. And if somebody joins, we want to be there. If there's nobody, close the call again, something like that.
I'm okay with that. I would mention though that other community calls do get cancelled.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Right. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I suppose it's the rules, I guess. Under what rules does it get cancelled? You know, like I've seen certain communities cancel the call because everybody is at KubeCon.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But I guess, yeah, it's the rules, right? Like, and when I canceled the call, it was canceled for everyone, right? Like, it wasn't just us. It was like it was gone from the Kuadrant calendar. So it wasn't like you could actually join, even, right? Like,
No.
um,
But it's also true, I guess, that like external people cannot edit that document. We could not base it on, oh, there's nothing in the agenda, because we don't really know.
well, that's something we should fix. So
I agree.
I guess I should share this with the Kuadrant group and give everyone in the Kuadrant group the edit permission, or at least I guess maybe do you want to give edit permission or community or comments? I'm not sure which, but some kind of permission to allow the change. But yeah, if we share it with the group that you have to be in to receive the mails and the calendar, then that's as much as we can do, really. You know, like if you make it completely public, I don't even know if you can do that with the Google Doc, actually.
Not within, if you're within the Red Hat account, but I think you can outside of it, like with your. Well, I would say like we should probably give just start with the edit permission. If that gets abused, which I don't think it will be, we should lower it down. But we should always start with more open.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take a note of that. So you edit to open. Canceling. So spelling canceling one. I can't spell anymore. Google spells for me. So canceling. So what are we saying we want to do then? Do we want? Oh, Phil's raised his hand. Phil, go for it.
I'm just thinking, is a place that we could land here? Like, I'm aware it needs to be cancelled occasionally, but if anyone could join even for like 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and if someone does come along, we can at least have an interaction with them and say, it's cancelled this week, but come along next week and we'll discuss that. And here's the agenda. And not just you came, but nobody's here. It just feels like a terrible first introduction.
I would agree with you if the call was still in the calendar, because the only way to get to the link is in the calendar, and you have to go to the calendar and see it's there. So if it's gone, then you're not going to come. So like. I don't know that it's a real thing that people will actually turn up on the day after the event's been removed from the calendar.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I still see the potential there for someone in a different time zone to have like set an alarm to have joined the call or whatever, and not seen that during their night's sleep it got cancelled or what. Like, I still see the potential for like a bad experience that we could avoid, right? I mean, I know I'm kind of reaching there, but.
Edge case. I set an alarm.
Plus, what happened on Google Calendar when you actually copy a calendar into your account? If you delete the original event, it also deletes on the copy.
Yeah. Like I've got the Kuadrant calendar on my own calendar, and then when I deleted let me double check this to be sure. Last week. Last week.
There's a duplicate option as well. Again, this is total edge of edge cases, right? But if you duplicated it, you have a copy of it. It's not the same as the original event.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, you need to
okay,
subscribe.
so we won't cancel, or so we will cancel, but somebody has to join for 5 minutes to say that actually it's sort of cancelled because I'm here.
No, I would just say let's try not to cancel. Let's not the default should not be cancel. Like it should be like, really we have to cancel? Like, damn, everybody's sick or whatever. So that's all I want to say.
In general, we don't cancel, even if there's no agenda.
I would say that's correct.
Okay, let's go with that.
I think if we do cancel, and maybe we have to put more emphasis in the Slack saying that it is like we add it into the as like a pinned topic, or it's something that people can see when they first see it. Oh, today's cancelled, or even like a quick mail out to the newsletter or to the mailing list. Oh, today's cancelled. Something that is just not a mail or a calendar disappearing.
It's very interesting this, because what I did, because I did it, right? Like what I did was what I've seen others do that worked for me when I've joined calls that have been cancelled, which is remove the event from the calendar, and then under the date put cancelled, right? So that if somebody does join and goes and looks at the agenda, they see, oh, it's been cancelled. Okay. So I did those things because that's what's worked for me in the past.
Yeah, I suppose where my head is at with this is because, like, I would agree with what you're saying there. I guess where my head is at is, I suppose, it's our community for a start. We're trying to build is like a different perspective on it for me, right? And then secondly is we don't have one yet. So I don't want the first person in the community to get like a bad experience. Is kind of where I'm coming from. I'm not suggesting that means we need to change decisions.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna stick with what we said here, right? So we're gonna avoid canceling it if possible, and then if we do cancel, somebody needs to join and wait 5 minutes. All right, it's gonna be Thomas that's joining and waiting 5 minutes, by the way.
Just one small suggestion, Craig. When you do cancel it, normally you can put in a little note, prompts you. Do you want to put in a note when you actually cancel from calendar? There's no harm putting a message there, because that appears in the email then with details. You can say like no agenda or face to face.
I'd be really surprised if I didn't do that.
It didn't. There wasn't any this time, but yeah, if you do that normally, like I think that's sufficient.
Yeah. Okay, next is Guy. What time are we at? Got 10 minutes. We're okay.
Yeah. I was surprised by something that Rob Scott said yesterday in the Gateway API channel about Gateway API CRDs not being part of core Kubernetes even after GA, right? I actually had the never. He did not say never, right? But he said even after 1.0 GA, it will continue to be a CRD-based API.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that in any way changes anything for us.
I wasn't surprised by it.
Okay.
And I think the reason is having been around Kubernetes for so long now, like they don't want things to go into like core Kubernetes because it's already big enough and it's already hard enough to deal with. So I don't remember where I heard this, but at some point I heard that like new APIs will basically be CRDs. So I wasn't surprised. You know, I can imagine that they will have like a recommended set of APIs to install, and this would be on that list. But like I'd say if they did ingress again now, right? Like not every cluster probably needs that. So like, why is it there? Is it like a core thing? And maybe that should be a CRD that you add on after the fact if that's what you need, right? So
yeah, I think it kind of makes sense, and other people are not surprised. And to be fair, I think Rob's point was precisely what you said, right? I just wonder if that in any way raises the barrier, you know, for people who want to try Gateway API, even before they even get to know about Kuadrant, right? So they want to try Gateway API, maybe unlike Ingress that's already there, right? Even though you do need an Ingress controller installed and running, at least the API is there by default, right? Whereas for Gateway, you need to install something first, right? And so there's another step. I don't know if that in some way, you know, pushes users back from it.
I guess it leans towards like Alex's idea of, is Alex here? I don't know if he's batteries included Kuadrant, right? Where you like install Gateway API and install a basic provider so that like you don't have to do that step, you know. And if all you're really using Gateway API for is to bring HTTP traffic into a service, well, like, you know, there you go. You're off. You're up and running, right? So yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess it depends on what their use case is as well. You know, I guess it depends how hard the community pushes it as well, right? Like if a lot of extra functionality, like Kuadrant and other policy providers and other gateway providers build out all their new functionality and all their awesome functionality around Gateway API, I think pretty quickly people will be installing it into their clusters. You know, so I guess that's probably an important aspect to it as well.
Yep, fair enough. I think Jason and Roy are both reinforcing on that point, either on the providers pushing for it or maybe on the distributions of Kubernetes, like OpenShift maybe has it by default or whatever.
Somebody mentioned, I think it was Chris, maybe mentioned that Istio were going to depreciate or remove virtual service and replace it with Gateway API, something like that.
Yeah,
like
completely switch over to Gateway API for 1.0, I think, or something like that.
So that's another, you know, that's a big push, right, from a community to so that kind of thing, I'd say, is what will drive adoption of Gateway API. I don't think it changes anything for us, no, other than doing the batteries included idea. Okay, we are through the topics. Anything else? We've got 6 minutes. No? Thomas, you going to hang on for 6 minutes just in case?
Next week I will come with a different you know, with something on my hair, and I will pretend to be an external contributor. My experience.
The snap camera. Do you know the snap camera? Remember everybody was using that during COVID. All right. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.